introducing me already. Thank you, Jill. Again, thank you to the Ontario branch of IDA for inviting me to speak to all of you tonight. I've prepared a very brief overview of some common myths based on my experiences about perceptions of dyslexia. And some slides will have true and false statements, and I'm hoping that you can test your own knowledge and understanding as we go along. I'll also provide teacher and family resources and videos throughout the presentation with some hyperlinks. These resources have been chosen based upon ease of use, impact, as well. Most of them are free. In general, my own story is that I've been transformed as a reading specialist because of the knowledge that I've gained from understanding dyslexia. I've been mentored under reading recovery as well as master literacy specialists. During my Master's of Education, I have taken courses for diagnostic reading instruction. However, when I became a reading clinician, these mentors and courses simply didn't provide me with enough tools or skills to help those students who were very much struggling with reading, spelling, and writing. Therefore, I sought out for many years to understand our most vulnerable learners and try to figure out how to best meet their needs. Along the way, I've had to change my practice significantly, and that has been the most rewarding experience of my career. Basically, dyslexia has been the avenue to which I've learned how to teach reading. This, of course, is a very broad topic for under an hour, and this is a mere summary of a very complex topic. There's always more to learn, and we have constant emerging discoveries occurring in the field of dyslexia, including the reading sciences, psychological sciences, and neurosciences. Before we begin with the basics of dyslexia, I would like to address the gravity of our topic. We must keep in mind that the United Nations protects the rights of students with disabilities. And as Canada is a signing and agreeing member of this, we must uphold this commitment in our schools, school districts, and with curricular documents. In particular, this addresses the persons with disabilities, that they must have equal access to an inclusive education and the lifelong learning process. With the Accessible Education for Students with Disabilities document, it is also recognized that all levels of schooling must meet their duty to accommodate and instruct appropriately. Further, schools must maintain accessible, inclusive spaces. The needs of a learner with dyslexia, like any type of disability, is protected under the Human Rights Provincial Commissions through the United Nations Protection of the Rights of Students with Disabilities. And this is also a very recent publication, which is in part funded by the Government of Canada's National Essential Skills Initiative. For me, the concept of essential literacy skills for all intertwines with the field of dyslexia. This report speaks volumes to the impact that literacy skills has on poverty, unemployment, and other emotional outcomes. Of course, all literacy skills are not all related to dyslexia, but those with dyslexia are at a greater risk of poor literacy skills, especially if they do not have appropriate instruction in school and environmental supports. In a nutshell, literacy skills for all is essential for our well-being and engagement with society. So now we'll start with the true and false pieces. So again, for me, addressing the needs of those with dyslexia is a social justice issue. Studies provide evidence that incarcerated individuals have significantly higher rates of illiteracy than the population as a whole. Repeat offense is significantly more likely with youth if they have low literacy skills. Our society pays a high price for low literacy. Adults who are poorly educated or lacking job skills are also far more likely to end up behind bars. And from the US, the Correctional Education Association, they find that half of the people who come to prisons haven't finished high school. If we do the math, costs in Canada, there's $215,000 per year for each youth in custody. And if we talk about teaching special education teachers, if we have 3 special ed teachers, that would be $210,000. Wouldn't it be more effective and cost saving to provide appropriate literacy instruction so that we meet all students' needs early on before the potential negative impacts happen? For this one, dyslexia is only about reading. Well, of course, in the definition, that is what it is. But this diagram here will explain a little bit more of what I'm trying to get at. There are several cognitive undercurrents that are part of the profile, and there are comorbid behaviors that can occur frequently with dyslexia. This will be discussed in upcoming slides. But depending upon reading exposure, some students might be able to compensate early on for reading difficulties, while other characteristics such as can't find the right word when speaking, problems remembering phone numbers or the alphabet or dates or telling time, handwriting difficulties, losing place in text, might be in evidence early on. And because these students can be unnoticed, they are then left untreated until the reading gaps are more challenging to address in later grades. So what is the diagnosis? It can be found in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is a manual used to diagnose and identify other vast ranges of disorders. Only school psychologists can diagnose dyslexia, while others, such as informed educators or dyslexia specialists, can recognize possible identifiers. However, there can be a difference in the terms used for diagnosis. For example, in Ontario, I've learned the term learning disabilities is used in schools. For private assessment, some psychologists might use the term that is specific to the DSM, specific learning disorder in reading. I provided the link from the Ontario Psychological Association for their procedure to diagnose and assess LD. I believe that the variety in terms, variation between provinces and territories, and methods of assessment add to our collective confusion and inaction when it comes to dyslexia in Canada. In 2013, the DSM-5 has revised the diagnosis into a single category, a specific learning disorder, which captures the overall difficulty experience in the academic domain, allowing the diagnosis to specify the details of the areas of academic difficulty, like, for example, in reading, writing, or math. However, as professionals working with students experiencing these difficulties, we know that these three classifications frequently overlap, and they are highly interrelated and should not be considered separate. For it to be diagnosed, it needs to be significantly impacting the individual's ability to read, spell, write, develop numeracy skills. Further, it shouldn't be used for students who have not experienced some type of intervention. However, this is where the difficulty is. What type of intervention was used? How often? To what fidelity? At what age? Etc. You need to be able to show that the student has been significantly resistant to an effective and appropriate intervention. Neurobiological means that this reading disorder is brain-based and not acquired by environmental factors. It cannot usually be diagnosed with other issues, such as intellectual disability or other developmental disorders. You can have dyslexia, like behaviors, which can still be directly targeted using methods for dyslexic learners, but the diagnosis of dyslexia might not be applied. It should be also noted that in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, dyslexia is listed as an alternate term for reading disorder. The International Dyslexia Association has a common language definition that is widely accepted and useful for teachers, parents, and students themselves. Please note, though, that the secondary consequences are comprehension and poor vocabulary and less reading. Comprehension is not the reason that these students struggle with reading. I often need to clarify this, as a lot of our instruction in schools is based upon comprehension-first philosophy. There's also agreement on the fact that rapid automatic naming, working memory, short recall of numbers and letters, and orthographic patterns, such as the spelling patterns, are also typically impacted with students with dyslexia. That is, it's not just about phonological awareness, although that is agreed to be the core issue. Dr. Marianne Wolf also suggests that there are students who have single deficits in phoneme awareness, which is the ability to hear and create and manipulate sounds, single deficits in naming speed, and then the double deficit kids who have had both. You can have students who might have difficulty with both manipulating sounds and naming speed, which might suggest that these students will need more intense and perhaps longer intervention and targeted instruction to mitigate their gaps with reading skills. So in Manitoba, we use the term dyslexia as an alternate term. Now, this is true. However, I'm not so sure if it's seen in the schools as a diagnosis that commonly. We usually do use the specific learning disabilities term, but we have listed it in a document that we have created in 2015. This document represents a starting point for Manitoba's attention to specific learning disabilities. Unfortunately, this document does not provide sufficient policy directives, curricular guidelines, or specific strategies which would be helpful in our classrooms. We need an interdisciplinary approach for students with dyslexia as well as all learners. Why do we shy away from including school psychology, speech and language pathologists, and their knowledge of learning and speech development? In Manitoba, we have psychologists who study reading disabilities, yet they are not working with or interacting, as far as I know, with our faculties of education. So this one is true. To address some of the confusions from the term dyslexia, the U.S. Department of Education issued a letter addressed to various stakeholders and education systems in the U.S. The purpose of this letter was to clarify that there is nothing in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that would prohibit the use of the terms dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, evaluation, eligibility determinations, or IEP documents. This is a mandated federal perspective. However, in Canada, our education systems are organized and led at the provincial level, which leads to discrepancies in our responses to dyslexia across Canada.
Sorry, Valdine, to interrupt.
Yeah.
We're just getting a couple of people saying they're having trouble with the audio, so we're just wondering if you could just slow down a bit.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry to bother you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so this one is true or false. Brain functioning is different in people with dyslexia. Yes, that is true. A distinctive neural signature found in the brains of people with dyslexia may explain why these individuals have difficulty learning to read, according to a new study from MIT neuroscientists. For example, when dyslexic students see the same word repeatedly, brain regions involved in reading do not show the same adaptation seen in typical readers. This suggests that the brain's plasticity, which underpins its ability to learn new things, is reduced, says John Gabrielli, a professor of brain and cognitive scientist and a member of MIT's Brain Research Institute. There's also evidence that brain functioning changes after effective and targeted instruction, which makes the dyslexic brain function more like a skilled reader. Therefore, teachers can change brain functioning as well. Phonological awareness is the only possible identifier of dyslexia. Well, first, what is phonological awareness? Phonological awareness is an umbrella term, essentially meaning the manipulation of sounds. It has nothing to do with letter-sound connections. Phonological awareness can be described as being able to create rhymes, breaking up words, and putting them together in sound only. The core deficit in dyslexia is poor phonological processing ability, which is why dyslexia is sometimes referred to as a language-based disability. But it's not the only identifier of dyslexia. For example, some other symptoms might be, as mentioned, difficulty rhyming, associating sounds with symbols like phonics, sequencing and ordering sounds, trouble identifying and comprehending signs or logos, late talking, and persistent trouble with word retrieval, which is a kind of phonology if we think about it. Difficulty following simple or complex directions, difficulty with little words when they're reading, inability to learn the alphabet, inability to put sounds together to make words, inability to read except for a few simple words. Confusions between the left and right is seen by some as a possible marker, and others are delay in learning to tell the time and confusion in orientating in time and space. Pronunciation mistakes can inhibit orthographic mapping or the spelling patterns, or the ability to pick up those spelling patterns as they relate to sounds. Reading and spelling are, of course, interrelated with how a child will pronounce words. It is often seen that students with dyslexia remember words differently, mispronounce words, and have difficulty retrieving words. Another one that I feel is really important is a family history of dyslexia, slowness in reading, and poor spelling in other members of the family. That also can be seen as a really good indicator of possible dyslexia. From this graph, you can see that dyslexia can be so much more than reading. Of course, it is a word-level reading difficulty, but there are many co-occurring conditions. And the cognitive underpinnings can affect so much of our students and children's lives, according to the Learning Disabilities Association of Canada, such as visual spatial processing, executive functioning, the planning and decision-making processes, processing speed, memory, and attention, such as comorbid issues like ADHD. Around 40% of people with dyslexia might also have ADHD. And those with dyslexia use about 5 times more energy to complete mental tasks. Our students and children are working very hard to keep up with daily tasks and attending to activities when learning. Part of what we need to understand is how much effort and energy is required for them to function in a world that seems to be biased towards those who can read and write innately. I've given you some different links and slides to investigate further. So it might be helpful for you to look at the websites. And of course, I'm going to refer you to the Ontario branch of the IDA as well. They have many, many great resources on their website for signs of dyslexia as well. However, for the signs of dyslexia, how do we differentiate between regular struggling readers and dyslexic readers? Is it necessary? Is the instruction going to be fundamentally different? Is the pacing and delivery style, whole class, small group, one-on-one, going to be different? It's difficult, first because for decades we were ignoring dyslexia, but with advances in our understanding of reading and our brain processes, we can now begin to study with increasing clarity. And as I said, Because of my understanding and learning about dyslexia, I have become much more effective for all of my students, not specifically for those just with dyslexia. Seeing letters and words backwards is a characteristic of dyslexia. Well, I hear this quite a bit, but dyslexics do not see words backwards. The BD letter reversal, for example, is mainly caused by deficits in interpreting left and right. So Stanislaus Dehaene states that mere recognition is one of the functions that we have to partially unlearn when we learn to read. It is a universal feature of the primate brain that is, unfortunately, inappropriate in our alphabet, where letters P, Q, D abound. By somehow managing to maintain this ability, dyslexics might be at some advantage in visual, spatial, and even mathematical skills. That is, some dyslexics might perform well on visual spatial tasks, such as arranging shapes, thinking with pictures, and recreating 3D designs. Now this one is about prevalence. So this is, I would say, true. There are some different ways of looking at prevalence of dyslexia. Autism does occur in approximately 2% though. Depending on the definition used, 5 to 10% of the population is considered to have dyslexia. However, because of the nature of the definitional issues, an estimate of prevalence is specific to a particular sample and to the definition used in the study. Are our schools diagnosing 10% of students with dyslexia? I would suggest the answer here is no. Should they have to diagnose every student who has dyslexia? I would argue yes, but the essential takeaway should be that we must have followed Tier 1 classroom instruction to prevent needless struggle. Also, are we seeing more than 10% of our population struggling with developing literacy skills? I would suggest that here we are creating reading difficulties because of the way we instruct reading. Prevalence rates of learning disabilities are inconsistent and poorly measured in Canada. Moreover, the definition of LD varies according to province and territory. And this is an evidence with Statistics Canada percentages, which indicates that only 3% of Canada's population with learning disabilities self-reported this in a StatsCan 2017 report on disabilities. Dyslexia does not exist in different languages. Well, this is, of course, false. From Uta First of the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, the researchers took positron emission tomography scans, or PET scans, of the subject's brain activity. Well, they took both reading tests and word sound tests with Italian, English, and French speakers. They discovered that whereas the Italian speakers did better on reading tests, they did as poorly as the English and French dyslexics on the word sound test. All three groups showed the same reduced activation of the left temporal lobe while reading. This means that in an Italian population, there may be hidden cases of dyslexia. And on the other hand, otherwise mild cases of dyslexia may appear far worse in irregular orthographies like that of English or French. This study highlights the impact that the complexity of our spelling can have on reading proficiency of dyslexics, and therefore on severity of dyslexia and the ease of diagnosis. So children with dyslexia are likely to have parents with dyslexia. Like I mentioned before, there is a strong genetic component of dyslexia. A family history should be completed on all screening procedures and diagnosis reports. The difficulties of a student with dyslexia can be exacerbated by a parent with dyslexia who is already affected potentially with poor literacy skills, and perhaps modeling low motivation to read, and even more challenging, the belief that their child will just not like reading or do well with school because they themselves had a hard time. What typically happens if a child is identified and diagnosed is parents then diagnose themselves through their child's familiar behaviors that they recognize in themselves. The experience of having a diagnosis can be freeing and allows a family to move toward accurate information about their struggles and more awareness of what exactly to do. This one is an interesting one. Dyslexia occurs more frequently in boys than girls. That is false. Boys tend, I mean, some of the pieces here I'm asking are, boys tend to act out, whereas girls tend to want to blend in. Is that true? Is that why they're more, that we assume that there's more, dyslexia in boys? In my experience, I probably have seen an even split between girls and boys, but it would be interesting to think about it in your own specific context and experiences. So it's just the fact that boys are more likely to be identified than girls. Interesting to think about. Children will outgrow dyslexia. We can develop reading skills and writing skills. We can use effective instruction to help with print-based learning. We can help develop phonological awareness, which will in turn support reading and spelling skills. However, dyslexia does not go away, and it is lifelong. Processing speed and working memory can be exercised as well, but improvements in these areas might never transfer to print-based skills. Some of us will always read slowly and have difficulty learning to spell correctly, and that can be okay. However, students with dyslexia deserve effective and informed instruction. They can make progress and can begin to see themselves as capable learners through these efforts. So visual problems in dyslexia. For students with dyslexia, it can be hard to keep track of prints. That can be. Some students report that it does help to have larger print or different colored papers to read from. However, current research consensus indicates dyslexia is best characterized as a problem with language processing at the phoneme level, not a problem with visual processing. Therefore, direct, explicit instruction on language processing at the phoneme level is essential. There is no independent research evidence to support colored overlays or special lenses having any effect on word reading or comprehension of children with dyslexia. However, it might be interesting to note that in Canada at BBC, they've been studying visual tracking and rapid naming in partnership with a laboratory from Brazil. The screening unit is conducting a collaborative study to learn about the early signs of dyslexia in kindergarten students. They're using assessments to measure saccade control, small involuntary movements of the eyes, and phonological awareness, the ability to map discrete sounds to letters and syllables. Eye tracking technology and phonological awareness assessments might enable early screening to identify dyslexia in kindergarten before it affects reading development. That's the premise of that study. Certain medications have been found to be effective in treating dyslexia. Well, this is false. Does medication help with reading? It might help students to focus upon the print and other learning in general if they have ADHD, but without instruction, the core skills will not be addressed by medication. All students with dyslexia are intellectually gifted. Well, this one is false. Although we do love our children with dyslexia, I notice that they have creative ways of looking at the world, can be intuitive and sensitive to the world around them. There's no evidence to suggest that they have specific skills that are naturally going to be stronger for them. As well, for a diagnosis, using the difference between IQ scores and reading skills, the discrepancy model, is faulty and antiquated. For a diagnosis, we must be able to notice the learning profile as specific to word reading, spelling pattern, mapping or orthographic mapping, rapid naming, working memory, as well, phonological processing. Further, even if students have a lower IQ, they should still be included for remediation. Direct and targeted and structured literacy should be offered to all. From Dr. Linda Siegel from BC, the discrepancy model between IQ scores and reading skills has been discredited. There does not need to be a discrepancy between IQ and reading skills for a problem to be identified. The use of the discrepancy definition is not supported by scientific evidence. So dyslexia is caused by literacy poor home environment. Well, this one is false. We cannot blame parents or the environment for the difficulties students are having because of dyslexia. Even though there are gadgets that distract, iPads that take up too much of our children's lives, and there can be maybe not enough books in the home, dyslexia is neurobiological, that is brain-based. No matter how many books are in the home, if it is dyslexia, despite some of our best intentions with literacy-rich environments, surrounding children with books will not mitigate dyslexia. Literacy-rich environments are helpful, but they're not linked to the prevention or treatment of dyslexia. Students with dyslexia or reading difficulties are not trying hard enough. Well, I've heard this much too often. Actually, these students are trying much harder than most students, and that's usually why parents note the difficulties first, as their child is simply exhausted from exertion all day long at school and striving for the skills that other students take for granted. Many successful dyslexics have a resilient attitude, maybe a rebellious attitude, and they get that from outside the academic world, usually. They also get that from support and encouragement. In addition, some also develop an incredible work ethic that doesn't stop. which helps them achieve their goals. It is essential, especially in the hit and miss of targeted instruction for our students, to immerse them in hobbies or interests that build their competency both in and out of school. Getting them familiar with what they aspire to do after school will give them something to look forward to and build upon their sense of self-worth. Well, this is true. They are highly correlated. Many with dyslexia experience high stress levels, especially in interactions with teachers, worries about assessment and performance testing, causing emotional problems such as fear, shyness, loneliness, and physiological problems such as, or symptoms such as nausea, tremors, rapid heart rate. That's from a study from 2008. Progress with intervention may be agonizingly slow and frustrating, and others might have never had the proper support. Some have been compared to their siblings or classmates, leaving them to feel embarrassed, cautious, and defensive. More than half report quality of life problems in the at-risk or clinically significant range. We hope to make schools and other educators and pediatricians more aware of the distress children with learning problems and their families may be experiencing, and take steps to address it. This is from the author of that study from the Journal of Learning Disabilities. Now, let's just take a fun break here. Can you name some famous dyslexics? So I'm just going to kind of go through the slides, and maybe you'll be surprised with some of these. So Caitlyn Jenner. This is, I'm trying to speak to the fact that individuals really can be have high achievement. These perhaps are the exceptions to the rule. We need to work hard so that our learners with dyslexia can see their unstoppable potential, even if they struggle with specific tasks. Reading is just one element of learning and does not define their value or potential. So Caitlyn Jenner just speaks about the fact that if he had been a better reader, or she, sorry, had been a better reader, that it would have come easily to her and the sports would have come easily. And she would never have figured out how to work hard for what she achieved. Dav Pilkey, I try to get the point across that not everybody thinks the same way. There are obvious benefits to being book smart, but I think common sense and creativity is just as good, maybe even better. Rick Riordan, author of the Percy Jackson series. Dyslexic kids are creative, outside-the-box thinkers. They have to be because they don't see or solve problems the same way other kids do in school. And in school, unfortunately, they are sometimes written off as lazy, unmotivated. Steven Spielberg, award-winning director. It's more common than you can imagine. You're not alone. And while you all have this, you will have this for the rest of your life. You can dart between the raindrops and get where you want to go, and it will not hold you back. The Princess Beatrice of York. Dyslexia is not a pigeonhole to say you can't do anything. It is an opportunity and a possibility to learn differently. You have magical brains. They just process differently. Don't feel like you should be held back by it. And Aaron Brockovich, when someone helping you gets frustrated, don't let them. Take a step back because you can't learn anything under pressure, and don't worry about the label dyslexia. Dyslexia is a sign of great potential. I think this is true. Sir Richard Branson, who dropped out of school at 16, said his dyslexia was treated as a handicap by teachers, and his teachers thought he was lazy and he couldn't keep up or fit in. And he pointed out that Albert Einstein, Henry Ford, and Steve Jobs are considered to be dyslexic. To change perceptions, we must celebrate all that dyslexic people have achieved so that young people no longer give up before they have even started. We must make sure every school not only has the resources necessary to identify dyslexia, but also the support necessary to champion dyslexics and enable them to thrive. He has founded an organization called Made by Dyslexia, which is a global charity led by successful and famous dyslexics. Their purpose is to help the world properly understand and support dyslexia. And another one, Henry Winkler. His books are inspired by his own true life experiences, whose undiagnosed dyslexia made him a classic childhood underachiever. The Hank Zitzer series is based on the high spirit and funny adventures of a boy with learning differences. These types of reading materials can be inspirational and supportive for those children who need to find role models and examples of what is possible for them. They can read these books and recognize that they are not alone, that other kids have dyslexia too. So we need a formal assessment and diagnosis. Well, I do not believe that's the case at all. If we over-identify those with reading struggles without using a label, provide them with evidence-based essential instruction, with systematic and explicit phonics done to the pacing that fits their learning profile, we might not need a formal assessment, and perhaps they might not ever require a diagnosis. Pfeiffer, in fact, says that early identification and targeted instruction can help eliminate academic problems that are frequently caused by deficient curricula and poor instruction methodologies. That's quoting Pfeiffer. However, diagnosis is a gift and a relief. A diagnosis can provide hope for enhancing treatment access, availability, and effectiveness. As with the label, also comes knowledge, which can be empowering. Students can also see themselves in different ways. Rather than labeling themselves as incapable, the diagnosis can help them understand who they are and buffer their self-image. Is early screening necessary? Well, yes, I would absolutely say yes. I think most people would agree. We need to have early identification of the most struggling readers in our schools. The earlier struggling readers are identified and provided systematic, intensive instruction, the less severe their problems are likely to be. That's from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, by the way. Over time, the achievement gap widens between children who have well-developed literacy skills and those who do not. Where does screening occur? Doctors can provide informal question-answer screens, schools and psychologists or dyslexia specialists. So the recent article that's referenced here suggests that red flags for dyslexia risk can be measured at a preschool age, and that neuroimaging research has demonstrated that dyslexia is heritable and that it is undergirded by brain differences that are present even before reading instruction begins. Therefore, early identification is also being advocated by the medical field, in which pediatricians will have growing awareness and the ability to investigate behavior, which might get help to families earlier, perhaps before school starts. However, this still remains a school-based responsibility. True or false for this one? Well, I think I've kind of hit that one a bit hard already. According to Dr. Marianne Wolf again, we have developed the writing-reading system over 2,000 years, but a child is given 2,000 days to gain the same insights. We need informed and systematic and explicit instruction in reading. Structured literacy instruction in the areas of phonology, the sound-based parts, sound symbol association, which is more like the phonics-based component, syllable type, so the multi-syllabic or multiple tap words, morphology, which is the meaning-based, syntax is the grammar of our language, and the semantics, the meaning base of our words, is essential. Both the International Literacy Association and the International Dyslexia Association have stated clearly that phonics is a done deal. It is essential. A great example of research by Dr. Giorgio, a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology in Alberta, has started a project that followed 290 grade 1 students with reading difficulties across Edmonton public schools. In 2 years, they have reduced the number of children continuing to struggle in reading to just 7, a mere 2.4% of the number of children they started with. They used early, targeted, direct instruction with trained practitioners and controlled reading materials based upon the teaching of intense, systematic, explicit phonics. English is too difficult to teach directly. Well, this is interesting. I would say that's not correct, but the part of it is correct in the sense that English is an opaque language. So if you see the European map on the side of the slide there, this European study looked at the decoding ability of nonsense or made-up words for students at the end of grade 1 in different languages. Notice that Italian students have an error rate of only 5%, but the English-speaking students have an error rate of 67%. This just reinforces the fact that our language is opaque, but that means we need to teach our language system directly with much thought to the scope and sequence in a literacy-rich environment. Memorize or guessing at the whole word. Okay, well, this one is definitely not true. McCandless's Stanford study, he had subjects recall words that they had learned by sounding them out, and he found that they activated circuitry in the brain's left hemispheric sphere commonly used by skilled readers to identify words in a fraction of a second, and the impact was also seen a day later. And the opposite was the case for those in the same study who were taught to memorize the words as a whole part. McCandless states that in this research, the label of dyslexia seems secondary to the associated understanding of how reading develops and understanding how we become successful readers. For Manitoba's Association of School Psychologists, they're quoting Dr. Kilpatrick, and they state, teaching children to read using picture clues and prior knowledge prompts actually directs their attention away from the letters and words on the page. It simply reinforces the kinds of habits that naturally occur among children who struggle in reading. From Dr. Kilpatrick, he states, weak readers, not skilled readers, rely heavily on context. Guessing words from context is not as efficient as phonic decoding. Skilled word recognition does not require context. Skilled comprehension requires fluid articulation of individual letters to their sounds and then to word recognition to longer text passages. In other words, word recognition improves reading comprehension, not using guessing. So what is multisensory instruction? There's a great document that you might want to look at from the Canadian Language and Literacy Research Network. So what they say is that multisensory instruction makes links between the visual, what we see, auditory, what we hear, and kinesthetic, tactile, what we feel. It is a recommended method of instruction for those with dyslexia. These three pathways are taught together, that is, learning a new letter or pattern, carefully tracing it with correct and consistent strokes to form the letter, as in the curve of a D before the stick, and pronouncing the corresponding sound. These types of methods are used in Lindenwood-Bell and the Orton-Gillingham approach with programs such as Barton or Wilson or Orton-Gillingham. And what is structured literacy? Well, structured literacy teaching stands in contrast with approaches that are popular in many schools. It teaches oral and written language skills in an explicit, systematic manner. Evidence is strong that the majority of students learn to read better with structured teaching of basic language skills, and that the components and methods of structured literacy are critical for students with reading disabilities, including dyslexia. Essential for some, beneficial for all. Teachers directly trained with a simple view of reading will pay attention to both word recognition or decoding and oral language skills. We could teach phonological awareness, that's sound manipulation, letter sounds, the phonics, syllables and word parts, including those that provide meaning, such as morphemes. We could also teach the structure of sentences, paragraphs, grammar of our language, and the language comprehension skills, such as vocabulary, prior knowledge, and oral language skills. That is what structured literacy is about, direct instruction of the components of our language. Teachers are satisfied with their ability. Well, Canadian teachers, I believe, are working very hard. There are many daily demands of running a classroom. Quite simply, higher education is not preparing our teachers to meet the needs of students with dyslexia. And we need to do a better job with curriculum and training that supports our teachers. The teachers that I know are committed, caring, and want their best for every student they have in the classroom. However, in general, educators across the world, and I have many citations here, but I didn't include that in this slide, are not prepared, and they're saying that they are unclear on appropriate identification and how to support students with dyslexia. And the research that I have listed here on the slide is from Toll, and this is specifically from Canadian teachers and their responses about meeting the needs of students with disabilities, learning disabilities. So do we need dyslexia specialists? Well, I think we do. The majority of those diagnosed with specific learning disabilities will have difficulty with reading. And even in a low estimate, there would be at least 1 to 2 students in each classroom who will have dyslexia. And that is not even accounting for those students who are lagging in their reading skills. In Minnesota, they do have dyslexia specialists who help to increase professional awareness and instructional competencies to meet the educational needs of students with dyslexia or identified with risk characteristics associated with dyslexia. They are hired to assist general education teachers and special education teachers to recognize educational needs. Now, what are Canadian schools doing? There are ongoing barriers reported by the Human Rights Commission, accessible education for students with disabilities, barriers reported in Manitoba, reported by Barrier Free Manitoba, called the Accessibility of Manitoba's Education System document in 2018, and Barriers to Access in Ontario Public Schools from ONBIDA in 2019, presented to the Town Hall on accessibility, such as ineffective communication to parents, inadequate training for educators, insufficient resources and supports in the classroom, negative attitudes and stereotypes, ineffective dispute and resolution processes, outright denial of disability-related accommodations, accommodations for reading versus access to effective instruction. And then the other difficulty here is that there's differences between different districts and divisions, even across Canada, about how we support those with dyslexia. I feel that we can do a lot better. Now, on to one of my pet projects, I would say, something that I'm very, very proud and happy to be a part of. Last year, Manitoba Education Training partnered with Orton Gillingham Training to provide OG, or Orton Gillingham, to sold-out attendance. Teachers were also able to apply their OG training to special education professional development hours that would go to a special education certificate. We are training whole schools, certain grades and entire school divisions, French immersion schools, English schools, private and public school settings. The training focuses upon classroom educators, but we have had speech and language pathologists, school psychologists, literacy specialists, reading recovery teachers, parents, educational assistants, and administrators. French immersion schools have taken a keen interest in Orton Gillingham training and are providing a French version based upon synthetic phonics and multisensory approaches to reading, spelling, instruction. School divisions are providing teachers support through teacher access to divisional PD funds, as well as providing sub-costs to be able to attend this training. Teachers are also able to take advantage of our OG Resources Grant and teacher scholarships for practicum. An essential component of our training is that you have an option to be mentored and coached over several months with implementation of OG in your school. We're also collecting data from some of our OG trainees. For each classroom educator training, we have a parent seat reserved so the parents are informed and have a broader understanding of their children. Parents help with the quality of the training as they can voice their experiences amongst teachers who are earnest and sincere in their efforts to reach all children. The focus on this training is to provide our school system with the tools it needs to deliver structured literacy instruction. Structured literacy should be offered to all students, not just to those who can afford outside tutoring with their own money. Further, structured literacy should be offered at Tier 1 so that students can develop into more effective readers at a more efficient pace. Manitoba teachers are committed and caring, and I'm very proud of my colleagues for embracing change practice and keeping the needs of our students front and center. It's an exciting time to be an educator in Manitoba. And the quotes are there from a document that was created from a particular school that's doing quite a bit of work with Orton Gillingham and with their teachers. To build on the momentum, so many dedicated professionals and parents have presented to the K-12 Manitoba Education Commission. We formed a group called the Parent Educator Partnership for Literacy Achievement in Manitoba, and we want to ensure that literacy achievement is the focus of our education system. We're also arranging an event that's coming up in April 2020 with Brent Sopel and Dr. Linda Siegel, and we're also going to be showcasing some of the projects and the practice that teachers in Manitoba have been working on in the last couple of years. So we're really excited about that. I hope that you can attend that event. And we're having it at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, which we're really excited about. Now, for those of you who would like to research more about teaching reading and the reading sciences, here are just a few more interesting researchers. I've mentioned quite a few during the presentation as well. And I just wanted to mention that ONBIDA will be hosting an event with Dr. Kilpatrick with more details coming soon. So that's going to be a very, very interesting event. I quoted him a few times in the presentation. I would encourage you to attend that event. And now, does training have to be expensive? No. There are so many resources which provide a great starting point online. And the ones I've listed here are all for free. You can also access through various U.S. Departments of Education many different dyslexia handbooks and initiatives that have been happening in the U.S. The information is out there. These sites can be reached with the hyperlinks on the slides, and these resources are specifically helpful for those who are educators. And all of them I've referred people to before, and they all are really valid and for various reasons, but mostly more for educators. And again, I just want to remind everybody to use Ontario branch of the IDA as your source of information. The Ontario branch of the International Dyslexia Association is an incredibly knowledgeable and effective organization that provides information, support, and advocacy for individuals with dyslexia, their families, and educators in Ontario. There are many online resources that will give you a better understanding of dyslexia, the importance of early identification and effective intervention, and other ways to support a child or adult with dyslexia. The next one is close to my home. My family, upon the passing of my mom a few years ago, we decided to offer a student scholarship in my parents' name. It's, as far as I know, the first of its kind in Manitoba to specifically offer a scholarship for a post-secondary student going into their first year. And we're really happy to celebrate the success of students with this disability and label, and give them an opportunity to walk across the stage with acknowledgement of the work that they've done throughout their high school and going into an advanced study after high school. So we're really proud of that and happy to be able to share their wonderful and inspiring stories. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to present today. And I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts. Facts and data won't change people's minds if we have preconceived notions. However, relationships can create change. Onvida encourages you to reach out and find connections within your community and beyond. Let's listen to the stories of those with dyslexia. The best path towards change is all of us working together, teachers, families, and students, towards our common goal, making our precious children's lives better, helping them see themselves as capable, and providing them with core literacy skills, which will help ensure that they will be engaged citizens and happy individuals. We all want our children to reach their potential. Let's keep sharing our stories and celebrating those in our communities who are working tirelessly for our children's best interests. Thank you, Ontario branch of the International Dyslexia Association, for this wonderful opportunity.
Great. Great. Can you hear me? Hope so. Thank you, Valdine. Thank you so much. And I'd like to encourage people now to post any questions you have on our Q&A. I'm not seeing too many come up, but we'll give that a minute or two. Maybe I'll throw a question out while we're waiting. You mentioned Orton Gillingham. I'm just not sure many people here might know what that is, and I thought maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Right. Well, the Orton Gillingham approach was created from Dr. Orton, and the names Orton and Gillingham are in the people who created the approach to teaching. Now, it's not a program, and that's why I mentioned a couple of programs that are Orton Gillingham based. And like I mentioned, multisensory instruction is part of all of that, and also a specific type of explicit linguistic phonics instruction. So a lot of it is a particular process for a lesson. It can be delivered in a whole class setting or a small group or one-on-one. And it can be, like I said, it is the first level is for classroom educator. Some of it can be used, of course, if you get more advanced training, to be used in a one-on-one type scenario, more for intensive intervention. But it's been here for decades, and it's just more recently been recognized as something that can be done at the Tier 1 level.
Yeah, Tier 1 being classroom instruction.
Yes,
I think it's fair to say it's been sort of the foundation of this newer term, structured literacy,
yes.
which I think encompasses maybe a little bit more than what was in the Orton Gillingham approach that was for intervention program, and we're expanding it a bit under the umbrella term of structured literacy, which has really been a term, I think, promoted by the International Dyslexia Association and
Yes.
in their knowledge and practice standards document that they've got. Joanne, maybe there's some other questions coming in here now. I see lots coming in.
We have Melissa Mercer, who'd like some advice on how to convince a school to provide these. I mean, I'm sure you faced that at the beginning.
Convince a school?
To provide, yeah. How do you get your school to provide the resources? I mean, there's a will out there, but there's, an established system of
Right.
right? Yeah.
That's a good question. Like I said at the end, I do think a lot of convincing is based on relationships. It might not move the ship for when you want it to be moved, but a lot of times, and I think that's kind of what has been part of the, I don't know if it's the magic or, the success of what we're trying to achieve in Manitoba, but we do have really good relationships amongst ourselves, and we do have a good core of people who have tried it, have used it, have seen the effect that it has, and therefore change is just easy because we have word of mouth. And I always say good news travels really fast. And in this case in Manitoba, I would suggest that that's what's happened. I think building relationships with people, I think also just making sure that everyone knows that we're on the same team goes a long way. I know that that's, there are situations where you might need to be a little bit more direct and kind of forcing a situation. And I think that there is time and place for that. But convincing is not an easy thing to do. But a lot of times, having people just understand that this is not just, a small situation, that this movement really is happening across the globe in terms of direct instruction. And I use the term synthetic linguistic phonics. So it's happening in the UK. Australia is also talking about using a phonics screen. In the States, obviously, they're going into more of a dyslexia kind of legislation type approach. So, sometimes just giving information that it's just not you and me here at the table talking about my son or daughter. It's a global movement of how do we teach the English language in a more effective way. That can maybe help. I'm not sure. It depends on the situation,
Okay.
Yeah.
We have 3 more questions, all of them quite relevant. One of them is, you mentioned French immersion schools being on board. And there's, in Ontario, we find that students with dyslexia or learning disabilities are often discouraged from continuing an immersion. Some people would like to know your views on children with dyslexia being in an immersion program.
Well, I mean, it depends on the way the language is being instructed. I think that, actually, I'll give you a little bit of personal information. All 3 of my daughters are in French immersion, and they all have markers of dyslexia, shall we say. We have it in our family in a personal sharing moment here. But they all are in French immersion. I think that the students, again, it depends on the situation. I would say that, to be realistic, it will be hard for a student who has a language-based difficulty, like I mentioned, the phonological components, manipulating sounds, that kind of thing. It will be more of a challenge for them to keep the reading and the spelling in order. But as far as the oral language and expressing themselves and maybe interacting in an oral language environment, I think it depends on the students. I mean, a lot of non-dyslexic kids don't manage in a French immersion environment either. So it really, again, it depends. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that question very well, but it really depends on the student. It can work.
If an OG trained teacher teaching immersion, then
well, and that's kind of what's happening in French in the French immersion schools that have been getting the training. They're actually taking that OG model, that type of lesson planning procedure that we instruct with, and using that direct instruction of the components, the smallest component parts, like the maybe the syllable parts or the spelling pattern parts, and teaching that directly to the sounds. And so they're using, they're actually using it and creating it in the French language. So that can be extremely helpful, because in Manitoba, our model is more oral language focused in the K1-2, and they don't do a lot of, in French, and then so they don't do a lot of direct instruction, and they try to use English as sort of a supporting component, which I understand, but it can be, difficult for a student who might have dyslexia, right, to get the code in both languages if it's not directly taught. So that's really encouraging that they're thinking of how to instruct it directly in French if students are in French immersion. So, yeah.
We have another question, and this is, I've been a school principal, so I know this might be difficult, is you mentioned teachers are signing up for the training.
Yeah.
And have options to go deeper into the method and receive a mentor and do practicum hours with students and all that. Um, are schools recruiting teachers for training voluntarily, or are they saying, in our staff, we're training all our teachers? Like, how is that going?
I think that is, again, I have to brag about Manitoba, but this is completely organic. Nobody's been mandating it. Mostly what's happened, and you know, partly because Manitoba unfortunately has across Canada comparable low literacy achievement rates, we come by this really in earnest and sincere effort. We see that we need to do things a little bit differently. And so this has been mostly a grassroots movement. Actually, it has been. Nobody's been mandated. I mean, I can't think of one person that has been mandated to go. But mostly it's been teachers just saying, I really need to figure this out. And it has been word of mouth. So it's mostly word of mouth, and then teachers coming back from the training and just saying, this was rocked my world. Why didn't we do this in my BEd, my Bachelor's of Education degree? You know, I should have known this my entire career, that kind of stuff. And so then, you know, other teachers are encouraged to go. So
Valdine,
and attend the training.
How many hours do the teachers get in the training?
Well, it's 8:30 to 4:30 for 4 days. So it's 30 hours, and then they can choose to take the practicum after.
Oh,
and the practicum the practicum is basically, it's all standard to the Academy of Orton Gillingham practitioners and educators.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's practicum following with lesson plans and things like that. So it's a little bit formal, but honestly, for me, even myself, getting the training, I really needed to have that person walk along with me, because it was, for me, a big change in my practice. So
one of our participants wants to know if you're familiar with the C-pen, the scanning pen, and whether you find do you find it effective?
Oh, there's lots of accessibility tools, and I'm not prepared or would, I'm not sure if I would want to, you know, discuss all of them, but I am doing a presentation in Manitoba in a couple of weeks about accessibility tools. Yeah, the C-pen is great. I mean, again, one of the things that I mentioned in the ongoing barriers is, you know, these types of accessibility tools are being used as a substitute for instruction, and we have to be careful with that. And, you know, I do work with university students, so I get the validity of accessibility tools, but, you know, there's a fine line between using that as a replacement for instruction. I tend to use accessibility tools as a support of the instruction, let's say, or to make sure that they're not falling behind in terms of intellectually stimulating material, let's say. But yeah, the C-pen is a great tool. Yeah.
You're also, sorry, go ahead, Jill.
Well, I'm just thinking the time here, we're at our hour. I think we'll wrap up here.